Welcome to our program, Professor Lucas.
Thank you so much for having me here, and thanks to all your viewers.
US President Joe Biden has allowed Ukraine to strike deep inside Russia with US-made missiles. Ukraine has struck Bryansk region of Russia for the first time using long-range ATACMS systems. 6 missiles have successfully hit Russia's ammunition depot in the Bryansk region. What does this President Biden's decision mean from a political point of view?
I think it means two things politically. I think the first, immediately related to the long-range missiles, is it removes the handcuffs from Ukraine and how it could fight this war, defending itself against the invasion. We have waited since April, when the first missiles were delivered, for Ukraine to make use of them effectively. Now they are being allowed to. Secondly, beyond that, I think we are looking at a path which is going to end at some point with attempted negotiations. And the ability to use these missiles to strike inside Russia gives Ukraine a stronger hand as we go to the negotiating table. Generally, it will force the Russians to think how far they can press with their military operations without the risk of being attacked. Specifically, it means it is more likely that Ukraine can hold on to part of the Kursk region in Western Russia, where they have been since August. And that occupation of Kursk is a bargaining chip. It's a bargaining chip against the Russian occupation, especially in eastern Ukraine.
Do you see this Biden's decision to allow Ukraine deep strikes inside Russia as a retaliation, as a response to the North Korean deployment to the Kursk region?
The American story is that they only decided to allow the use of long-range missiles once they knew about the North Korean deployment. But I think that is a pretext. I think the fundamental here is Donald Trump. Donald Trump was coming into office in January. Once Trump is in office, because of his basically ties to Vladimir Putin, there is no chance that the U.S. would have allowed the use of the long-range missiles inside Russia. So the Biden administration had to act now. If it did not act now, any possibility of this weapon in Ukraine's arsenal was gone. And so I think the balance swung. I think those in the administration who have been arguing for this finally persuaded the president, for the sake of your legacy, you cannot leave Ukraine hanging in Donald Trump's hands. You've got to give them a fighting chance.
Do you believe that Donald Trump will reverse this President Biden's authorization for Ukraine to strike Russia with American-made missiles?
Certainly Donald Trump can try to reverse the decision, but it makes it more difficult to do so. Because when you make a decision that Ukraine can strike with the American missiles, American institutions are now invested in this. The Pentagon is invested in this. The State Department is invested in this. The CIA is invested in this. I have no doubt that Trump, if he gets a word from Vladimir Putin, will say, Ukraine should stop doing this. But the agencies may push back against that decision. In other words, it's much more difficult for Donald Trump to reverse a decision once made than it would be for him to block a decision that had never taken place.
How could this Biden's decision to allow Ukraine deep strikes inside Russia influence Donald Trump's national security policy towards Ukraine?
Well, before we talk about the influence on Donald Trump, let's remember that it's not just the United States. We have been waiting for months to hear if British Storm Shadows, French Scout missiles could be used. Washington had reportedly vetoed that. As I speak to you, we are getting reports that the first British Storm Shadow has been used in Kursk. We're waiting for confirmation. But if that is true, we're talking about Donald Trump facing not just the U.S., but U.S. allies who have given permission for Ukraine to use this capability. Donald Trump doesn't have a coherent policy on Ukraine and Russia. He just simply has his gut feeling, and that is he wants to be the one to claim that he has stopped the invasion, but he is one who, since 2016, has been very much tied to the Russians. And so the question is, will Trump come in and support what is a genuine negotiation on both sides with no preconditions? Or will he support the Kremlin's line that it must be able to occupy not just Crimea, but 4 other regions in Ukraine, that it must be able to bar Kyiv from ever joining NATO, and it must limit Ukraine's military? I think Trump will try to do that, but each sign of support for Ukraine before Trump gets into office and before negotiations begin puts Kyiv in a better position, even if this remains a very difficult situation.
I also have a following question about the long-range strikes inside Russia, and later we will cover possible negotiations between Ukraine, Russia, and the United States. Do you believe that German government, after the federal election, parliamentary election, can allow Ukraine also to strike deep inside Russia with German-made Taurus missiles? Is this decision gets Ukraine closer to German authorization to use Taurus missiles inside the Russian territory?
Yes, the German elections produce a coalition in which the Christian Democrats are the lead party. Then it is more likely that Germany will allow the use of the Taurus missiles by Ukraine. That's because the main barrier to the delivery of the Tauruses is the current chancellor, Olaf Scholz of the Social Democrats. That chance of the Tauruses being provided will be increased if the Greens are part of that coalition, and if Annalena Baerbock, the current foreign minister, retains her position, because she's much more a supporter of Ukraine having that German capability. If the far left and the far right gain in Germany, whether it's the far right AfD or the far left Wagner group, then it's less likely that Germany will deliver the Tauruses, because those groups tend to support, indeed sometimes promote, the Kremlin's position.
Let's cover also the negotiation scenarios between Ukraine and Russia. There are lots of reports. Reuters today reported about Putin's willingness to negotiate a ceasefire in Ukraine, but in exchange of barring Ukraine to join NATO, Ukraine's neutrality, also reducing the size of Ukrainian army and reducing other military capabilities of Ukraine. What do you make of such initiatives, and what is your take on this starting position for negotiations, Russian starting position?
First and foremost, the report in Reuters from 5 current and former Russian officials about the Kremlin's negotiating position is a signal to Donald Trump, because those officials said Mr. Putin is prepared to speak to Mr. Trump. And then they set out what are not just conditions, they set out what are demands. And the demands the Russians will make is that they be allowed to hold most, if not all of, those 4 regions in addition to Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk in the east, Zaporizhia, Kherson in the south, that Kyiv would effectively be barred from joining NATO, that the Ukrainian military would be limited. It remains to be seen whether Russia would also demand that Ukraine's path to the EU or economic progress be suspended. So what the Kremlin was saying quite openly to Donald Trump is, this is going to be what we want from the negotiations. This is what you need to support. So now we need to watch Donald Trump's reaction. We know that Ukraine's reaction will be that this is a non-starter. You do not enter negotiations conceding territory to the Russians. You may have to concede territory to the Russians at the end of the negotiations, but you don't do it at the start. At the very start of the negotiations, you say that the fundamental is a Russian withdrawal from Ukraine, that we don't have any more Russian military forces trying to overrun the country. Now, the Kremlin probably will not, in fact, the Kremlin won't agree to that, but that's going to be the starting point from Ukraine. And the question is going to be, is there a position in between Ukraine's demand for full Russian withdrawal and Russia's demand for an indefinite occupation of at least some of Ukraine.
Do you believe in a possibility of a ceasefire in Ukraine and in a possibility of any kind of a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia in the nearest future?
I'm going to say something which may not be popular with your viewers because it's not the public line of the Zelensky government, but it is one that I think privately may be discussed by some Ukrainian officials along the West. And that is that in the short term, you accept a Russian occupation of part of Ukraine. Regrettably, they would be in most of the Donbass. They would be in parts of the south like Mariupol. And that in return, Ukraine has a guaranteed path into NATO and into the European Union, that it becomes part of a Western bloc, not just by getting some support, it is formally part of a Western bloc. In other words, this would be the 2024 parallel to West Germany and East Germany in the Cold War. You know, Germany had to give up some territory to the Soviet bloc, had to do so for 40 years, but in return, it got those security assurances as being a member of NATO and coming into the European Economic Community that meant the Russians could not take over all of the country. I simply say that could be a possibility that Kyiv is considering in discussions with international partners.
However, Kremlin officially declines the possibility of a ceasefire in Ukraine. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said that this initiative of freezing the war is not appropriate for Vladimir Putin. What does it mean?
Well, the Kremlin would say that. The Kremlin would say that we are not going to accept anything less than a recognition of our occupation. Indeed, possibly what Putin called an annexation in September 2022. Now, just this week, Turkish officials said that President Erdogan was going to propose a settlement based on a ceasefire, freezing the lines. Kyiv would continue to receive military assistance. The Kremlin rejected that out of hand. First of all, Russia is not going to negotiate until it reclaims all of the Kursk region. It will not negotiate with Ukrainian forces on its soil. And then when it negotiates, it will not accept anything less than an occupation of those areas that it holds in Ukraine. So how do you change that? How do you move to a ceasefire? You have got to push the Russians back. You have got to be able to hold the front lines in the east and in the south, and you have got to be able to strike inside Russia so you can continue to hold Kursk. In 6 months from now, if Ukraine continues to hold Kursk, if Russian oil refineries are being hit, if Russian air bases are being hit, if their naval bases are being hit, in other words, if Russia is on the defensive in an air war and a drone war, maybe they start to think about talking because maybe they realize they're not the ones who are on the offensive anymore.
Is there a chance of Donald Trump going after Vladimir Putin, turning against Kremlin and Putin, putting more pressure, doubling down support for Ukraine? There is some theories about such possibility among Western experts.
At this point, I don't think there's a possibility that Donald Trump chooses Ukraine over Russia because he's a transactional politician. It's like, what makes me, Donald Trump, look good? And Vladimir Putin and Russia flatter Donald Trump. Oh, you're wonderful, you can bring peace, etc. Whereas Donald Trump is very critical of President Zelensky for being honest. In other words, for saying this is a war that can't be stopped easily. That's why Donald Trump criticizes President Zelensky, because he gets aid from the United States. Now, can that change? Yes, but it has to change through other U.S. officials. We have to see if career officials in the State Department, in the Department of Defense, in the CIA, continue to argue that Ukraine needs this support and they stand against any effort to cut it. And even more importantly, are there enough Republican members of Congress? And remember, there were enough Republican members of Congress to get $61 billion of aid through in April. Are there enough Republican members of Congress that will stand up and tell Trump, for your own future, to make yourself look good, you need to be on the side of those who are being attacked and not those who are doing the attacking. I think it's a remote hope. I'm not sure enough Republicans will stand up to Trump, but that's what you need. You need to continue to reach out to the Republicans in Congress and maintain contact with American agencies so that you have some kind of defense line against Trump and his, let's say, thought bubbles about Ukraine.
Is Europe ready to replace American aid for Ukraine? And is it possible from financial and technical points of view?
Look, I think I need to be honest with your viewers. You know, America is by far the largest military in the world. It's by far the largest provider of military resources in the world. Europe cannot replace America if Donald Trump cuts the aid. Europe can try to cover some of this. For example, your viewers will know about the artillery shell initiative, which may finally reach 1 million shells by the end of this year. They will know about the, I think, key role of the EU in providing economic and financial assistance to keep the government going. But no, you can't replace the U.S. What you have to do if the U.S. cuts aid is you have to recalibrate. And what does that recalibration mean? What Europe can do is to provide some military aid. That military aid it can gather to Ukraine to try to check a further Russian advance. It can provide the economic and financial aid that means you keep the electricity on, you keep the water running, you keep the transportation going, you keep the economy going, and it can accelerate the path for Ukraine to join the European Union. It can say, you're not someone that stands apart from us, you are part of the EU. Because once Ukraine is part of the EU, if Russia attacks or continues to attack, it's a much greater threat to Europe than it is right now.
I would like also to ask you additional question about the European security. Do you expect European leaders to persuade Trump to support Ukraine, to get Donald Trump on Ukrainian side?
Certainly, the European leaders will try to flatter Trump. They'll try to, say to him, this is important for you to support Ukraine. The problem is Donald Trump hates the European Union. And Donald Trump has advisors who hate the European Union. They tried to break up the European Union in his first term and failed to do so. They may try to do so again. So I think two things the European Union does. First is it tries to reach out to those others in Washington that I've talked about, those Republicans in Congress. It reaches out to American arms manufacturers. It reaches out to American companies. It reaches out to the lobbying groups. They can try to influence policy. It tries to reach out to the American agencies, of course. But the second thing the European Union does is it unites itself. Now, there are a couple of people who we know will stand against Ukraine. We know that Viktor Orban in Hungary will stand against Ukraine. We know that Robert Fico in Slovakia will stand against Ukraine. But we need to see the rest of Europe saying Ukraine is part of Europe, not just in words, but in reality. And that means that the lead that is being taken by, I think, Poland and by the Baltic states, you need to make sure that France, Germany, Italy, states in Western Europe are on board with that. We need to have a united Europe, and we don't need a leader like we saw last week with Olaf Scholz in Germany, breaking that unity by going to Vladimir Putin and saying, hey, Vladimir, let's talk about how maybe we could end this conflict. You need a united stance within Europe, and then you communicate more effectively with the US and with the rest of the international community.
You just mentioned about a phone call between Olaf Scholz and Vladimir Putin. Do you see any kind of links between this phone call and President Biden's decision to allow Ukraine to strike deep inside Russia? Don't you think that Olaf Scholz tried to find a peaceful solution to try to begin negotiations? However, Putin refused to do so, and later Biden decided to finally allow Ukraine to strike Russia.
Certainly that is a theory that is going around, that Scholz was acting on behalf of Biden, perhaps on behalf of other European leaders, and saying, look, Vladimir, this is coming. Don't you want to come to the table? I've seen no evidence to support that. Now, of course, nobody would make that public. I see no evidence. I think I take the simplest explanation at this point, and that is Olaf Scholz is facing elections, national elections in Germany in early 2025. He is a weakened leader. I think it is unlikely he'll be chancellor after those elections. And I think he saw this as his chance, maybe his last chance, to influence the dynamic of Russia's invasion. It is a little bit similar to what Emmanuel Macron did just before the invasion in 2022, when he, remember, visited Putin and said, look, you don't need to invade. We can find a way forward. We saw what Putin did with that. And we saw what Putin did with the Scholz phone call. I mean, it had almost no effect. So no, I think Scholz acted because of German domestic politics. I don't think this was a Biden administration reach out to the Kremlin.
Thank you, Professor Lucas, for your time and for supporting Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you. Thanks to all your viewers. Please stay safe and good luck to you.